Hello and welcome to the Controller Talk podcast presented by Danfoss North America. Our goal is to provide you information about using Danfoss controls in the supermarket and warehouse industry, specifically in the US and Canada. We're doing these twice a month for now. You can catch these podcasts wherever you get your podcast, and it's also available through the Danfoss Rough Tools app. For the video version, check us out on the Danfoss North America YouTube page. Search for Controller Talk to see our video collection. I'm Dave Yoder, along with Chris Brown. Well, Chris, football season is among us and upon us. You're still talking baseball.
Read the room.
Oh, please. You were begging for a new offensive coordinator for the Ravens last year. You got one, and now you're undefeated.
I'm ready for the Orioles season to play out first before we worry about that.
Okay, so we're going to repeat last year and hope that the Orioles and the Phillies get together. And
there you go.
Yeah, and the Orioles will get beat up.
Assuming your boys won on Saturday.
The Penn State guys? Yes, Penn State football, they did win. They're playing Delaware Valley or Pee Wee All-Stars or something like that.
Got your warm-up game in.
That's right. Yeah, they're 2-0. So is Maryland.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, they are.
Okay, cool. So, baseball good, football good.
Life is good.
All right. If you're in this town, it is right now. All right. So, last time we talked about pack controllers. And we said that over in Europe, they call their racks packs, and that's how they got their name. And we talked about the basics, and now we're moving on to the next course, and something I like to call Pack Controllers 201. So if you can handle the first one, you can probably handle this one. So in most cases, these pack controllers are something you're going to see on new CO2 racks.
Right.
It's like you're not going to get handed one, and you got to figure it out from scratch. You're going to see them in new racks coming from the OEMs, and typically the OEMs are already going to have those programmed, or they're going to have us do the programming, and then they'll load the files.
Yep. Then pretty much if it's a CO2 rack, you can all but guarantee you're going to see one of these on there. So, yeah, that's a safe assumption. If any familiarity with Danfoss and our modules, it's not completely reinventing the wheel. I think you've got a good starting point if you've dealt with the Danfoss controls and systems in the past. The pack controller, we talked about a little bit on the last episode, but it looks very similar to one of our regular extension or I/O modules for most of the models that we have. We'll get into that some. But it's terminal blocks right there on the pack controller itself. So you've got some inputs that'll be on there and terminals for that. So your sensors, your pressure transducers, digital inputs are all getting wired right into the pack controller, and then your relays to control compressors, gas cooler fans, whatever we're handling from a control side, variable outputs. That's all items that'll have terminals right on the pack controller as well. I think for this show, we'll probably focus more on our what we call our AK2 platform of pack controllers. So specific models that gets into the 781A, 782A, 783A. And you will notice these all have the A at the end, which is the...
Is that the Canadian version?
Not quite the Australian version. No. No, It's just the updated model we have for those three model types that has that USB port on there to connect into it that we had talked about. So a little bit of a beefed up hardware on those three models.
Yep.
Specifically with the inputs and outputs, most of the time, what you're looking at, the inputs are going to be along the top of it, of the main pack controller itself, and then maybe even some of the extensions that you get into. But typically it's, when somebody says, where's my sensor wire to, you know you're going to be looking somewhere along the top. And so that's where most of your inputs are, which obviously means that most of the outputs that you're going to be controlling, they're going to fall along the bottom of the pack controller. And just orientation, keep that in mind. Maybe I know some of the racks that I've been in, they mount them sideways, which is perfectly fine to do, but that obviously means you got a left and a right orientation on the terminals as opposed to top and bottom.
Yep. In your experience, does the OEM provide a list of points inside the rack?
I've seen printouts. Now, whether they stay there a year after startup,
right.
Maybe is a different story, but to start at least when that rack ships out, I've seen a plastic sleeve or something like that, maybe on the back of the electrical door that'll have legends and maybe an IO list for the points on the pack controller and that sort of thing to give the guys on site that info.
Yep. Okay.
Yep. When it comes to assigning the points in the service tool software, so if we kind of switch gears a little bit to the programming side, we're putting each point in individually through service tool. And the pack controller itself, and again, these are expandable. We'll get into that a little bit, but the main pack controller board, and it is a little deceiving because there's a little section right to the right of it that almost makes it look like it's a different board, but it's part of the main base board. But the pack controller out of the box, you're getting 11 inputs, configurable for what each one of those inputs is going to read. And then you get 8 to 10 outputs across the bottom, depending on an optional board you may or may not attach to it. So as far as programming the individual points, you always want to consider that the pack controller itself is board one. So we get into addressing a board and a point for each one of our inputs or outputs. The pack controller, any point on that pack controller main board is going to be considered board one. So your first input up at the top left would be board one, input one, or 1 in the program through service tool. Your last input would be something like board 1.11 or 1-11 in the setup. We get the output sides where maybe, again, somebody that has some a little bit of experience with Danfoss. This is the curveball in it all. So when you talk about the outputs, you just have to be aware of a little different setup there. For a lot of our boards, the system managers, you start at output number 1 on the first relay or first analog output on those boards. With the pack controllers and any boards attached to them later on, we carry over from inputs to outputs. So on the pack controller specifically, we said we have 11 inputs. So our first relay output at the bottom, when we're going to assign that in the program through service tool, it wouldn't be output number 1. It would be board 1.12 or 1-12. So yeah, it's a little different structure from what you're probably accustomed to, but definitely something you want to be aware of and make sure you're adhering to it when you're programming those points in. So we've got the typically about 8 relays again, like we said, that usually will take you through the last relay assignment, which would be point 19 on the pack controller board. You can have an analog output module, and there's different options here, but one of the options for analog output points, there's a AKOB 110. You can actually take the cover off of the pack controller, and you can attach this OB110 extension board or extension module right onto the circuit board of the pack controller and then put the cover back on over top of it. And that offers you 2 analog outputs that would look like, when it's all said and done, it looks like they're just getting wired right into the pack controller like anything else. And I'm sure there's a good reason why we skipped a few points there. But when you go to assign these, again, just take into account that the points on the 2 analog outputs using this module, they would be outputs 24 and 25 in the programming.
Right. Yep. And I guess one advantage of having these numbered this way, where you would go 1 through 11 across the top for inputs and 12 through 19 for outputs, is that it makes it a little bit less likely to have a wrong assignment. I don't know if the software will allow you to program an output like 1-5, but
it'll initially, what I've seen there is it'll initially accept it.
Okay.
But if you leave that page and come back to it again, it's all zeros. So you don't necessarily get that immediate warning that it didn't accept it. But if you go back and look at it later on, it'll have wiped it out.
Long term, it's going to be gone.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And the AKOB is for the Star Wars fans out there.
Yes.
There's got to be a tie-in somewhere. All right. So, when it comes to plugging in extension modules, obviously this, like you said, it's on the AK2 platform, so it's expandable.
Yep.
You can plug extension modules in there, and we'll use basically the same numbering system. So let's say you plugged a combo module into the pack controller, it's number 2, or it's in the number 2 position.
Right.
So we know that type of board has 8 inputs and 8 outputs, so the inputs would be 2-1 or 2-1 through 2-8, and the outputs would be 2-9 through 2-16. So yeah, it takes a little bit of a different thought, but once you see it, then it comes pretty quickly.
Yep.
And so let's say you kept going and you plugged an XM101A into the number 3 position. So you have pack controller, then a combo, and then an XM101A. We know that it's got 4 inputs at the top and 4 at the bottom. So as far as programming goes, the points would be 3-1 through 3-4 across the top, and 3-5 through 3-8 across the bottom.
And it is just 2 numbers. Maybe we can point that out, that it's not like the comm module setup back to the system manager where you have the node, the board, and the point. Here it's just the board and the point. So it is just two numbers you should be dealing with.
Right, that is true.
The pack controllers, these models have a rotary dial on the front of them, but that doesn't play into the point addressing in any way. That's just how that would tie back into the system manager.
Yep.
On the display side, so these AK2 platform models, 781, 82, 83As, they don't have any built-in displays. So when and if somebody wants some sort of visual display of pressure, temperature, that sort of thing right there, and this would, if we're going to do this on the packs, it would be because maybe somebody cut out a hole in the front of the electrical panel on the rack to display some values there. But you do have the option to connect some different types of displays into the pack controllers to get some values. And it's really more so just for that, just for the displays. It's pretty limited what you can do as far as programming with these. So this would be more of for just a traditional display purpose.
Yep, to give you something like suction temp.
Yeah.
Where basically it takes the CO2 pressure, converts it to temp, and says, here's what it is.
Yeah, I think you can do, I want to say valve opening degrees is one of the options you could choose. So it's just, if somebody decides that has value to them and they don't want to have to go through the system manager or through service tool every time to see what's going on with certain things, then I've seen a few customers that wanted to have that in there. And so, yeah, that can give that somebody walking by or going up to maybe troubleshoot further. That'll at least give them a quick indicator. But yeah, the specific models. So we've got the older EKA displays. They're typically going to be red. And we've used these with dozens and dozens of products over the years. But there's a couple ports up in the top left area where you could connect this type of display. It can be up to 4 of them. You'll need a cable with crimped ends for this one, and the distance from the pack controller to the displays, you can get up to 45 feet. Again, that's probably way more than anybody that would be looking to use these would ever need, because they're going to mount it within a few feet of where the pack controller is, but you can get up to 45 feet if needed. And then we have a second display type. This would be the newer of the two families, but there's something called a MMI GRS2, and this is used for some other product types of ours too. This one gives you a little more information. It's a little bit larger of a display. It actually pulls in some data from the pack controller and can display that right on the front of this MMI GRS. So that's an option too that somebody could look into if they wanted a display. It uses the RJ11 port, which is right above the USB port on the pack controller. And this one is a little shorter. You can only get up to 10 feet here. So again, I think even 10 feet, you're probably fine just from pack controller to the front of the cabinet. But yeah, there is that distance limitation on this model.
All right, and as far as power supplies go, then you can run 24 volts AC or DC over to the pack controller. And if you have multiple extension modules plugged in, you want to start adding up the VA ratings. And you want to stop when you get to 32 VA, which is quite a bit. Yeah. And that's a long set of boards. Yep. But if you use the CM102, that allows you to break up the modules and kind of use a couple pieces of DIN rail, then the modules on each section of DIN rail can't go over 20 VA. That's the way it's spec'd out.
Yeah, and stepper modules is probably the one drawing the most there. It's usually only 1 or 2 valves on the rack, so right. I think all that's nothing we worry about exceeding too much.
Yeah.
Some more limited pressure transducer side, you get into maybe some more limitations here. We can't do more than 5 pressure transducers on each pack controller or extension module. So each individual board, not to say that the overall total can't be more than 5. It can, but just when you look at it board by board, you don't want to go over 5 pressure transducers. There's a milliamp threshold on there. 1 or 200 milliamps is what's in my head. I'm not 100% sure, but
we'll ask you in one of these podcasts if you know the right number.
When do we get to stump Maria?
She can't be stumped.
But yeah, just try not to go over 5, because you can start to get to where that limit is, milliamp limit on what the transducers are drawing. And then another limit that I can't say I've ever even seen us get close to, but just to be made aware of, that you can max out the total number of I/O points on the total package or total solution if you take what's on the pack controller and then any other extension module attached to it. You can't go over 220 points.
Yeah.
Again, that's probably 2 or 3 times easily anything I've ever come across, but that limit is there too that we have to keep in mind.
Yep, that's for the 782 and I believe the 781. We'll dig into more details on that in the future, but yeah, some of the big boys like the 782, that's your limit.
Yeah. And maybe that could be something that becomes more relevant as we move along, evolve, ejectors get into the pack controllers that we don't see a lot of today. So that could be a lot more relevant than I'm saying right now in 2 or 3 years' time.
Right.
And then if you decide to get a little crazy and start jumping transducers across multiple pack controllers, maybe you had a 781A and you've got one for the low temp side of the system, one for the medium temp, and you want to share the medium temp suction transducers, an example that we might jump over to the low temp pack to read as the low temp discharge because they're the same pressure typically. That could be a situation where you're jumping transducers across 2 pack controllers. We just need to keep in mind there that we want both, or if it's multiple, any of those controllers where we're sharing that reading to have a common power source. So basically the reason for that is we either want them all to have power or none of them. If we run into a situation where we are sharing a transducer across 3 pack controllers and one of them lost power, but the other 2 were still running okay, then what's going to happen is the pressure reading is going to read artificially low on the 2 that are still powered up with that transducer wired to them. So, yeah, try to keep them on a common power source if we're sharing the transducer.
Right. That's kind of a rare situation, but it's just a word to the wise.
And it's something you could carry over to case control. In some of the 750s and some of those AK2 model case controllers, you'd have the same thing there that you're looking at. So maybe that one's a little broader range that you could take into consideration.
Yep. All right, so a couple more things we want to cover. If you happen to be using an injector block, not a lot of those are being used yet, but I think we're going to see that come into play down the road. But if you are using the ejector block, you have solenoids that have to get wired in. And in general, you want to wire the smallest loads or the smallest sections of that ejector block into your solid-state outputs, which would be output points 12 through 15 on the pack controller. And then if you happen to be using the XM208C, which is it's a stepper module for 4 stepper valves that also has 8 inputs on the input side, then if you're using that one, you can use it with a pack controller, but right now you can't use it with I/O boards and COM modules and wire it into the SM800A, but that's going to change, and right now we expect that around December of 2023, you'll be able to use that module with the COM module and the 800A, and there'll be new software coming out at the end of the year for that.
Yeah. And just real quick, just back to the ejector blocks and the solid states, those are, when you put your eyes on these pack controllers, they'll stand out. I mean, we're saying they're the first 4 relays, but it's pretty obvious when you look at them that those plugs have 2 terminals on them.
And only 2,
And only 2, and they're separated one by one individually. And then the other 4 relays, your standard relays, those are part of a full terminal strip. So if you're worried about which ones are the solid state outputs versus a regular relay, that's pretty obvious to you once you look at these.
Yep. And I think down the road here, we're calling these the course 101, 201, but we'll get into the 301 course before too long, and I think that's where we'll dig into some of the common questions people have, like the way we label our sensors and things like that. Can be a little confusing until you see them in a list, and then it's not so bad.
Yeah, definitely.
And that'll be something we'll cover on the next time when we take our students up to the 301 course. You can charge more for those, All right, so so it's time to ask Chris a good question, and this is probably another unfair question of very minute details that
We
almost no one needs.
Rename this to Humiliate Chris instead of Stump Chris.
Well, they're one and the same, aren't they? So what is, specifically on that 208C stepper module? Yeah. So we're driving stepper valves. You know, in this case, it's probably going to be a high-pressure valve or a receiver bypass valve or something like that.
Yeah.
What's the current limit on the outputs of that guy?
On the outputs, the current limit.
Yeah. This is only a 15-minute podcast, just so you know.
Well,
15 to 30, anyway.
I'm going to say 500 milliamps.
Well, you're in the ballpark. Let's just say that. At least you didn't go crazy and say 4 amps, but now it's 325 milliamps.
All right. I'll take that as a win for myself.
That's right. Yeah. I have never seen a stepper valve need anywhere near that. Probably the highest I've seen is, 215?
On the old ETSs, CCMs, when you get into the CCMTs, they start getting up around 300 milliamps, I think.
Okay. So it is kind of relevant to pay attention to that.
Yep. And maybe that's good to tie in because we just talked about the stepper module, the 208C. There is a 208B, which is what we've used for years for our regular HSC job that had suction EPRs on them. That 208B has a lower amp rating on it, and so it can't handle the CCMT. If you got a CCMT on the pack controllers, you got to make sure you're using a 208C and not a 208B.
Otherwise, you'll be sadly mistaken.
Might be a little smoke going on or something along those lines.
Yeah, good to know. All right, so we are early in the season, so there is no listener mail, so we're going to jump right ahead and let everybody know if they have an email that they want to send over to us, given a suggestion for topics or a question or a comment or anything like that. If they feel sorry for Chris, just email us at controllertalknorthamerica@danfoss.com. That's controllertalknorthamerica@danfoss.com. Thanks for listening. Our studio and video engineer used to be Michael, don't call me Mike Beckerman, but I think he's moved on to other things.
They don't love us anymore.
Yeah, he's still here, but he's left everything to Maria. And she's doing it all, although Raul Garcia is still our audio engineer. Yeah, Maria's doing it all. Not even Josh Tignall showed up this time. We don't need him. Until next time, for Chris Brown, I'm Dave Yoder. Stay cool.